Good morning. My name is Felipe Martinez. I am a pastor at First Presbyterian Church in Columbus, Indiana. I am a member of the strategy team of Next Church, and it is my privilege to introduce to you my friends Mike Mather and Harges, who are here to present our keynote. When I talk about them, I also refer to Mike as my pastor and Diamon as my mentor, because that is what they are. We've developed a very close connection, though in fact we've only known each other for about 10 years. How I wish I had known you when I started ordained ministry. Right out of seminary, by all rights, my first call was the wrong ministry for me. I was a big city kid going to a small rural town surrounded by soybean and corn fields. Population, 1,200. My wife and I used to play a game to figure out places where we had been before where there had been more than 1,200 people. Our street in Chicago. Tracy's freshman dorm. I was young, I had minimal experience. This white congregation had never had a person of color in their staff. When I interviewed for that solo pastor position at First Presbyterian Church of St. Anne, Illinois, it became apparent to me that we were in different places theologically in a number of areas. And still, they called me. And somehow, I said yes. And on my 26th birthday, my wife Tracy and I pulled up to the manse with all our belongings packed into a small U-Haul. The manse was full of parishioners. Some were doing some last-minute touch-ups. Who does that when somebody's moving in? And most of them were there to help us unload. And someone even showed up with a birthday cake for me. But if the future of my ministry there had depended on the caricature I had been creating in my mind about them, rooted in my fears and insecurities, distracted by our differences, suspicious of their potential, I would not have lasted to the following birthday. But instead what happened is that they welcomed us into their community. Because that's who they are. We invited each other into each other's lives. And I came to see them fully for the talented, faithful, tenacious people they are. I hadn't arrived at the backwater of the realm of God as I feared, but at the fertile ground that had been producing a harvest of faithful ministry for over a century. And our ministry together lasted 10.5 years. Today, as I think back about those faithful people in St. Anne and about my time in that church, I actually hear the voices of Diamon and Mike in my ear, inviting me to see that church and that town from a perspective of abundance, not from the limiting perspective of scarcity. The way that Mike and Diamon view God's people gives me now the vocabulary to describe the gift that church and that town were to me and to my family. And what's more, Diamon and Mike challenged me to see and hear today with the full anticipation of encountering the giftedness of people, the uniqueness of the faithful, and even to enter into the raw nature of a complex setting. They helped me see what soon becomes very clear had been hiding in plain sight all along. And so I am delighted that I get to have Mike and Diamon here today to journey with us. So please help me welcome Harges and Mike Mather.
Thank you, man.
You know, Felipe may call us those things. What we call Felipe is friend.
I was thinking the same thing. The people that were on the committee that Felipe was on, would you stand for a second? Felipe, stand. Who are those people? Strategy team. Man, y'all good. But thank you for your service for putting this together. Felipe, thank you. Felipe called me mentor. I'm still tripping about it. But I think the real mentor for Felipe is his family. And his wife, Tracy, and their two boys are courageous. And when we see that, we should tell our children, even if they didn't come from us, the children on our blocks, thank you for being courageous.
Every time, every day. That's what, it's a little bit of what we want to try to talk about today, to just try to pay attention.
And even though we're up on this stage, and I always feel funny about being up here, what we really want you to do is to do this. Walk with us.
So a few years ago, I took a walk to South Africa. Well, it wasn't a walk to South Africa. It was a walk in South Africa. And when I got there, one of the people I talked with was someone named Charles Villavicencio. And he said, you know, we had a joke in South Africa in the 80s. And I thought, what was funny in South Africa in the 1980s? And he said, there are two possible solutions to our crisis here. One is miraculous and the other is realistic. One solution is that God will send down angels and sort us all out. That's the realistic solution. The miraculous one is that we will sit down and talk with our enemies. And all of a sudden I thought, why do I not trust the miraculous that's in our hands all the time around me in my community are gifted, talented, wise, creative, genius people. And I'm all the time thinking about the church or about the church serving people rather than trusting the miraculous that is growing up in the lives around me. And so we tend to think about these things and try to think about the ways in which in the church that I grew up in the church that I was trained in the church that educated me, you know, I was taught to help people, you know. I was taught to pay attention to the needs and do something about the needs. I was not encouraged to pay attention to God's abundance in the most unexpected places. But the scripture all around us, Brueggemann says, right? The whole story of the scripture is the story of the journey from scarcity to abundance. I was stuck at the first verse of Genesis 1. Hadn't made it all the way to the end. I was seeing low income, low wealth communities as that, rather than full of people who are doing amazing, life-giving things. One of the things that always happens is that people would come to me and say, because I've always served in low-income, low-wealth communities, is people come to me and say, hey, I want to teach a budget class. Really? Do you know who knows how to stretch a dollar better than I do? Everybody in a low-income community. I mean,
he meant that.
One of our neighbors is a woman named Carmen, and she has been evicted from every block in our neighborhood. If I got evicted, I would not know what to do. I went, and Carmen and I went out to eat, and I said, Carmen, what do you do if you get evicted? And she said, well, we gather the whole family together. We gather our friends, and then we say, who has room? Yes! Why am I not seeing this all around me? I had a friend who's been a mentor and teacher to me who looks like me, who went over 30 years ago to work in a low-income, low-wealth community in Indiana. And he went to make a difference, to be a savior to the people there, right, to help. And so he and his family moved in, and his young daughter, was making friends in the neighborhood, and she made a friend, a little girl her age, and she said to her, hey, will you want to come over to my house and play? Sure. And she brought her friend over to her house, and she took her up to her room, and the little girl she was with looked around and said, wow, you get this whole room to yourself? Wow. And I wondered, how often do we see our churches through the eyes of those we think we're serving? Wow, you get this whole room to yourself? You get this whole church to yourself? You get all these resources to yourself? Yes, we do. We think about it so often in these ways.
From the Gospel of Luke, some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell your disciples to stop." He answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would call out."
So the stones cry out and announce God's abundance, whether it is at the feeding of the 5,000 and the disciples want people to be quiet, whether it is the disciples shouting at blind Bartimaeus to be quiet when he's crying out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me," whether it is the way the Church of Jesus Christ wants only to see the scarcity and not the abundance that's all around us in the lives of people. We're always so much more ready to see the need and the brokenness than the joy that's bursting out in those places.
The community I grew up in, the family that I know, was thought of as broken and empty. Well, broken is the wrong word. Traumatized, maybe. No, I'm for sure traumatized. But we knew we were abundant because we had to be. My family come from a long line of people escaping slavery. They escaped from the South and ended up in South Bend, Indiana. And they ended up in the place on the west side where only African Americans could live. In fact, the city used to dump its biohazard. Memorial Hospital would drop its needles. People would dump in the swamp that was adjacent next door to the housing projects. No one thought of us as sacred. But that wasn't true of my family, my grandmother and grandfather, who grew up in the small block house, and the families that lived around that neighborhood we called the Lake. They treated each other as if they were important. They knew that every gift mattered. My grandfather and grandmother worked very hard and made very little. But Sam Cooke would sometimes show up when they would get to travel, and he would look for my grandfather because he said he knew where all the girls were. Sam Cooke knew that place was abundant.
Yeah. Although they were treated like they were broken, like they were traumatized, they didn't live that way. You know, one of my favorite things, Diamond, was you talking about your grandfather planting that tree when your mother was born. Could you tell that?
Yeah, so my mother is the oldest of three. And when my mother was born in 1952, in a little patch, my grandfather was kind of OCD. And remember, they lived in the swamp. So in the housing projects, just was a block and then had a patch of grass. But it was the most beautiful grass in that place. And you better not step on Uncle Buck's plot. But 1952, my grandfather planted a tree. And as my mother became teenagers, all the young people were around, and this is about the 60s, turmoil was hitting for the black community. My grandparents would gather around the tree, and the young people would gather and listen to the elders and listen to for solutions and abundance that were in their places, so they were reminded that they had each other. That tree was called the learning tree.
What do you call your group of neighbors?
What do y'all think? The learning tree.
Because you all know, you know that power that's there. Yeah. I was thinking of, that was the first story you and I ever shared when we sat down and talked the first time 20 years ago.
20 years
Dimon and I have known each other 20 years. It made me think about this book. I don't know, any of you read this book by, I'm sure I'm pronouncing his name wrong, Keynote Lemon. It's called Heavy. Any of you read that book?
It's a good book. You
should read it. It's a great book. So Keynote Lemon is a professor down, he grew up in Mississippi, and he and a friend of his, when they were in middle school, went to basically an overwhelmingly white school, except for he and his friend, Lathan. And they would teach each other words every day and then drive the teachers and their fellow students crazy by using the word every day. Like, he remembers one day in particular, they were teaching themselves how to use, in 5th grade, exuberance and abundance. And one of the things that his friend Lathan said at one point was, black abundance, they don't even know we have it.
It's like the Stones.
It's like the Stones crying out, And so even now as adults, they have conversations on the phone or in person, and one of them will say, it's that black abundance, and the other one will say, all day, every day, and they will then say together, and they don't even know it. They don't even know it. They were talking about their teachers, the people around them who don't recognize the world that doesn't recognize this abundance that's all around. Dimon is always paying attention. Dimon is a very, very, very gifted listener. When I moved to Indianapolis, Dimon and I had known each other in South Bend, and he had moved to Chicago. And when I moved to Indianapolis, 2 months later, he moved down there, and he would come down. He lived 4 blocks away from the church, and he would walk down and see me every day with his 1-year-old daughter on his shoulders. And he would say to me, oh, Mike, I just met Mr. Henry. He's at the corner of 32nd and Park, and he plays chess on his front porch every day. And when he's playing chess, he's teaching the young people about life and meaning. And he said, or I just went by the corner of 31st and Broadway, and these young men, the Buddha Boys, they're a local family, but people think of them as a gang. But one of them's a mechanic, and one of them's a musician, and one of them's a poet. And he would come and tell me about that. Why? Because he pays attention. Because he notices what other people don't notice.
And I think it's important in that neighborhood, just to say a little context, it's just like the places where my family grew up. People who have been traumatized. They're not noticed as those things. Those are the labels that aren't given to them.
Mm-hmm. And I certainly didn't know it. I hadn't paid attention in this way. When I thought about people in the neighborhood around, I thought about people I was helping or that I would invite. My question always as a pastor of church, how do we engage people? No. Dimon was seeing this right. The question was how do we engage people, is how do we get engaged in what God's doing in the lives of people around us?
And a lot of that is about friendship. In our friendship, one of the things that was a very hard time, my grandfather passed a few years ago. And when my dad had passed before, I had the courage enough to do his eulogy. But I couldn't do my grandfather's. And I reached to Mike and had him do my grandfather's eulogy with us. He was the only white dude besides white Jesus on the wall.
Yeah. But what I remember was at the wake, how all these people were coming up to each other and doing this and saying something to each other. And I said, Dimon, what are people doing? What's that about?
Power. My grandfather, when he sometimes had a little to drink on Fridays to relieve some stress, he'd come to the grandchildren, these big old hands, and our hands were really small, and he would crush them. And he says, power. And you
were expected to say back.
And he would grab our hand, and we had to do it with 2 hands. But he says, now say that and squeeze.
Power. Power. And over again, people were
Traumatized,
doing
not
that.
broken.
So we have a practice, right?
So we like to get people's bodies into the work, and this is a chance for us, even in the silence, to hear the stones cry out. So we're going to put our bodies into the gospel. So would you please stand?
So get everything out of your hands. Could you ask the person next to you for permission to hold their hand? Now close your eyes. If you grew up in a happy home, squeeze a hand. If you grew up in a home that would not have been described as so happy, squeeze a hand. If you ever wondered where your next meal was coming from, squeeze a hand. If you've ever been told to stop crying, that tears are cracks in your armor and signs of weakness, squeeze a hand. If you've ever been pulled over for driving while black and prayed to God that you would get home safe, squeeze a hand. If you've ever gone to war, squeeze a hand. If you've ever had to dodge a bill collector's incessant calls, squeeze a hand. If you've ever been misgendered or judged because of your identity, squeeze a hand. If you've ever wondered if a loved one may be deported, squeeze a hand. If you've ever smoked a joint while listening to your favorite artist, squeeze a hand.
Mary Oliver has instructions on living, and they're some of my favorite instructions. It's because it reminds me of the gospel. It reminds me of my ancestors. It's pay attention, be astonished, and tell somebody. Say that with me. Pay attention. Be astonished. Tell somebody. You may be seated. I think it's important, those instructions are very important because they're very simple, right? In the complex world, we try to inundate ourselves with a bunch of words and colonial way of learning. But those simple things are the things that we all long for. My neighbors in a low-income neighborhood where I live at in Indianapolis are those people. As Mike said, we have a little organism called the learning tree. It's where we make our neighbors our business partners. I make my neighbors my business partners. I do what I do because of my faith. I'm a member at Broadway, but I don't do it for Broadway. I do this with my neighbors, and I get asked to be at a lot of places, and I got tired of just traveling and not seeing things change. So I invited my neighbors to walk with me. And there are 5 core members. Wild Style, the producer, he lives directly across the street from me. He is the roving illustrator. He's a nationally acclaimed hip-hop artist and article writer. Amanda Wolf lives a few blocks away. Her title is the Executive Spirit. She's our CFO.
She keeps track of all the money that passes.
Not only the money, but the stories and the investments. And Shauna Murphy is a member of Broadway, is also in Mike's book. She's the VP of New Business. And then my friend January, she's a healer. We call her the animator of the human spirit. Now, January is a very important person in our neighborhood because not only does she do healing, but she gathers healers. I struggle with depression. I'm bipolar. And my wife is a healer. And she knows to put me around other healers and people who I would call friends. And when I met January, she was throwing parties out of her house. And I told Mike about this, and she started hosting meals. And in those meals that she said, I do this to remember, to create memories of abundance in her place. So when the parties leave, that people leave a memory. And she does this because she wants to, because she needs to, because she has to. One day she came to me and said, hey, I've been thinking about people that struggle with mental illness, because we often have conversations about that. And she wanted to focus not on the brokenness of depression, but she named 15 black men who were artists and creatives that found ways to deal and heal others with depression. She cooked a meal for them, us, Wild Style, myself, and the oldest was 55 and the youngest was 17. 12 courses. After the meal was served by her and some neighbors, they left. And they left us there looking at one another. And we wondering why we were here, and it was very silent, but there was a question on the table. I don't even remember what the question was, but after we read the question, we realized the importance of healers in our place, because she helped us see ourselves. January, there are thousands of them in our communities. They like the stones that we walk past every day, but they shouting. Be astonished by the things that we miss. When anyone says the word need, you replace it with the only thing that humans need is the need to be needed.
You know, one of the things, Diamond, man, when you told me that story, I just thought of how many times I walked by those stones. I mean, I know January, but that she was hosting these meals and doing that. And she did that because of the parties her grandmother used to throw. That's right. And she knew that. Now, I went to seminary, so I knew that what I should have done was said to January, January, come start this group at the church. No. What our calling was to say, man, January, you are a healer, to bring her in front of the church, to have her tell the story, to have people say, thank you. We see the way in which you are healing people. And because we see it in you, we know it's happening in 1,000 different places. It doesn't need us to happen. It needs us to notice that it happens.
Absolutely. Pay attention, be astonished, and tell somebody. You know, my neighbors and I no one calls us philanthropists, like they didn't call my grandparents and any ancestors of ours that grew up in a hard time. How do we bring people to the center from the edge and revere that, notice it, and celebrate that? In fact, at some point, you will hear those stones whether you like it or not. In our city, the group of us that we call Learning Tree in the last 5 years is $5 million in the 10-block radius.
Into the hands of people.
In forms of home equity. We did $1 million project for housing. We give $100,000 of our own income every year to support events. No one gives us grants. This is ours. When we walk and we ask questions of our neighbors, we don't ask, how can we fix the broken, but how do we sit with you in your trauma? Who do you give money to that you never expect back? And when they tell us it's a pretty big number, if a family of 4 is only making a median income of $20,000, they're giving away $100 a month. Well, you are philanthropists. No one calls us that.
Yeah. all around the community. Nobody not only notices that, counts it, pays attention to it, says that that's it. That's, again, you have this wonderful gift for that. Now, we have had a wonderful teacher for us in this, a woman named Judith Snow. And Judith died a couple of years ago. Judith was amazing. The least amazing thing about her was that she's quadriplegic. But she was just a lover of people and paid attention. We had her preach at our place. She lived up in Toronto, but she came down and preached. And one of the things she said when she got in front of the congregation was, she said, you know, when people say that they are God's hands and feet, that really pisses me off. Yes. You know, we keep saying, oh, we're God's hands and feet. No. God is active and present in the most unexpected places. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says, now remember who you were, dear sisters and brothers, for from a human point of view, few of you were wise or powerful or of high social standing, but God purposely chose what the world considers weak in order to shame the strong. And God purposely chose what the world considers foolish in order to shame the wise. And God purposely chose what the world looks down on and despises and thinks of as nothing in order to destroy what the world thinks of as important. Now, do we believe that or not? Or not, right. Over and over again. So we keep reminding ourselves about this. Pay attention.
Be
astonished and tell somebody. Our job is to do that, to be a witness to God's abundance around us. So I was thinking of that. Last year Elijah Cummings died. Remember that? Representative from Baltimore. He was one of the leaders in the Congress. And at his funeral, one of the stories that was told that was so amazing to me was the story about his father being at his first inauguration installation there in Congress. And his father was up in the balcony, and he noticed at one point, he looked up and he saw that his father was crying. He hadn't experienced his father crying. He didn't know what was going on. So he said to his father, afterwards, Dad, what was that about? I saw you were crying. And his dad said, isn't this the room where they used to call us slaves? Yeah. Isn't this the room where they used to call us 3/5 of a human being? Yes. He says, when I think of you being sworn in, now I see what I could have been if I'd had the opportunity. And I thought, again, what is it that we're seeing? How are we treating people? How are we bearing witness to God's abundance and power in the lives of places in people where we least expect it? Opportunity wasn't what I was offering to people. I wanted to help people rather than see their abundance. All our structures, all the ways in which we organized our life together at Broadway, all the reports we asked for, everything, were about scarcity. We're about what we didn't have rather than what we did have. So I wasn't paying attention. And Diamond called me. He'd been, walking around the neighborhood, talking to his neighbors, finding out. And we at Broadway had, at this point, for 30 years, been running a tutoring program. And in that tutoring program, I would go and get volunteers, not only from our church, but from Meridian Street United Methodist Church, St. Luke's United Methodist Church, Carmel United Methodist Church. I would get volunteers from United Way. I would get volunteers from Lilly Pharmaceutical. Yes. You know who I never asked for volunteers from? Our neighbors, right? Because, these people are poor, right? I'm talking about myself here, right? So Diamond calls me, he says, Mike, you got to talk to Maya. I said, why do I have to talk to Maya? He says, Maya does tutoring out of her house.
And Mike want me to give him the story, the 20-minute story on the phone, and I was, just call her.
I'm like, well, tell me about this. He says, no, call her. So I call Maya. Maya has been there in the neighborhood for 34 years, her whole life. She lives in the house her parents raised her in. She works at AT&T at nights, and when she gets up at 11 o'clock in the morning in the summer, she has the kids from her block come over to her house. And she says, and I tutor them. And I said, well, I don't know what you mean. What do you cover? She says, I cover everything from phonics to Sophocles. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, if they don't know how to read, we do phonics. If they do know how to read, we do Sophocles. And then every Friday, I have a barbecue in my backyard, and their families come over and they present what they've learned. Now, I should not be saying to Maya, hey, would you come tutor in our program? I should be saying to Maya, how can we be a part of what you're doing? How can we be a part of supporting and encouraging and blessing the holy, good work that you're about? So I invite her to church on Sunday because, that's what I do. I'm a pastor. And she's lived there 3.5 blocks from the church for her whole 34 years, and she's never set foot in our church. And you know how I know? She sits in the front row. And we had a practice at this time of on the last Sunday of every month before the last hymn, we would celebrate ministries that had died, ministries that were continuing, and ministries that were beginning. And we meant ministry, but we mean that in the broadest sense, not things starting in and through the church, but things starting in and through people's lives, right? So she's doing this work. So she comes and says, well, I'm not going to get up in front of everybody and talk because I'm too shy, but I'll talk to people afterwards. So we had a group in the church called the Animators of the Spirit, and they got up in front of the church as they do at this part, and they asked Maya to stand, and Maya stands, but her back is to the congregation, right?
And we're going to ask you to help us in a second.
So her back is to the congregation, and she's standing there, and the Animators of the Spirit describe what it is she's doing. And then the animators say, will those of you who will support Maya with your prayers, your presence, your gifts, and your service, and your witness, please stand.
Stand.
So, but she doesn't know that because her back is to the congregation. And then the animators, stealing from the marriage litany in the church, say, will all of you do everything in your power to uphold and care for this person in her ministry? If so, will you answer, we will? We will.
That's how Mike do it.
You may see. So, and all of a sudden, two things that had been invisible are now visible. We had not known there's people doing this holy, good work all around us. And she had not known there's a congregation full of people who are eager to bless and encourage and support and invest in what she's doing.
And if we had not shifted the structure from scarcity to abundance, figuring out how to grieve the things we were feeling bad about. I mean, one of the things that Mike helped us do is to bury all the things that were dead. We grieved. And we had practices of that. But we also invested a lot of time in celebrations and parties. Those things were important into our structure. Those were proof, corporately, how we lived out together in the world, our faith.
Let me just pause and say, Diamond told you a few minutes ago that over the last few years, that there's over $5 million that has come into the hands of his neighbors in a 10-block radius because of the way in which they are neighbors to one another. Not because there was nothing at the church, a program that did all this. In fact, across the 30 or 40 years of the church, maybe we did $2 million worth of programs, but we paid ourselves to do those programs. What he and his neighbors have done is something far beyond what the church could have done. But I don't know that it would have been possible if we had not stopped what we were doing so that we would pay attention, be astonished, and tell somebody. We had to make room for us to see. The problem wasn't Diamond and his neighbors. The problem is we wanted all the attention and glory ourselves. I mean, I loved it. I broke my arm patting myself on the back. People, love what we were doing so much.
It was this one. This arm.
It's true. But the hard thing is not doing the new thing. The hard thing is grieving the things that we don't do anymore. The hard thing is grieving, letting go, letting us be the center of attention. Letting all our language in the church is about us. About us being the witness to God's power and love at work. Us being God's hands and feet. Us being the mission in areas. Us being Christ's presence in the world. No, it's not about us. It's about what God is doing in the lives of people all around us. Do you want people to stand for this last thing again?
Yeah, in our closing, we're going to do some collective affirmations about
that your grandfather reminded me of.
Yeah. You want to read it?
So, okay.
You do it.
So
Mike.
let's stand again. And again, ask somebody if you can take their hand. Can I take your hand, Diamond?
No, Mike. Give me the one that's broke.
If you believe in the power of love, squeeze a hand. If you have taken someone, family, friend, or even stranger, into your home who would not have had a place to stay, as Isaiah said, squeeze a hand. If you have given money and never expected it back from someone, a friend, a family member, a neighbor, even a stranger, squeeze a hand. If you garden, squeeze a hand. If you care about young people, squeeze a hand. If you believe in the power of God to transform lives, to change history and rewrite our tomorrows, squeeze a hand. If you believe that there is nothing more powerful than love and that the long arc of the universe always bends towards justice, squeeze a hand. If you're ready to work every day to witness to God's love and mercy and justice and abundance, to shake the foundation of this empire, squeeze a hand. And now, would you raise them and repeat after me? We will invest in God's abundance.
We will invest in God's abundance.
With these hands.
With these hands.
We will free our people from prisons. With these hands.
With these hands.
We will cultivate power. We will cultivate transformation.
Cultivate transformation.
With these hands. We will do miracles. With these hands. Power. 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 We want it.
We want it.
We love it.
We love it.
We got to have it.
We got to have it.
Right now.
Right now.
Right now.
Right now.
Right now. Tell your neighbor, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You all have shared something powerful. Others have shared their hands, their hearts pumping blood through those hands, their spirits in the warmth of their hands. And so our benediction is, pay attention, be astonished, and tell somebody. Amen.
See why I love them? Man. Thank you. Thank you both. I did a poor job as I introduced them because I did not remind you that you get to ask questions. So my hope is that you are able to go on Twitter and with the hashtag NextChurch2020, you will ask Mike and Diamond a question. My hope is that you will write a question on a piece of paper and hand it to someone who will hand it to someone towards the end of the aisle so that they will be picked up and then they will be shared with them because they want to get your questions and they want to address your questions. And so as a way to start that ball rolling,
you're going to ask us?
I will ask a question. Diamond and Mike, I don't know if you feel the anxiety of the church in the same way that all people do, but there's an anxiety in the church about losing numbers, about crises, about splits. And you have talked to us about these 3 simple questions that Mary Oliver shared for posterity for us. What do you think is the hardest of those 3 questions? Or where do you think we get tripped up first?
I think it's pay attention.
Yeah.
There's a lot of complexity around paying attention because we pay attention to a lot of stuff, mainly scarcity. So the question is, when we talk about pay attention, what are we paying attention to? You know, are we paying attention to figuring out how we enlarge our seats on Sunday? Or do we recognize that all 4,000 people in a 4-block radius around our places are as part of contributors of our congregation and our parish? So paying attention would be the hardest.
I think it is too, because I think I was paying attention. The issue was, to your point, what you're paying attention to. You know, one of the most educational points at me for this was when I had a woman in a congregation in South Bend, Indiana, say to me on Pentecost Sunday after worship, "You said that Peter, reading from the book of the prophet Joel, said that God's Spirit flows down on all people, young and old, women and men." And I thought, am I awesome or what? It's a half an hour later and she remembers what I said. I'm a great preacher. That's right, I said, yes. And she said, so how come you don't treat people like that? I said, what do you mean? She said, when people come to our food pantry, you ask people how poor they are. You ask people how much is your income, how much are your expenses. You don't ask people what gifts they have. You don't ask people what they're good enough at that they could teach somebody else how to do it. You just want to know what's missing from people. You don't want to know what people have. So yes, paying attention, and really the point is paying attention to the right thing. And man, when you do pay attention to the right thing, then the being astonished part gets a lot easier. Yeah. Because then it's like, oh my God. Should I tell that story? Okay. So the first person who comes to us when we do this is a woman who lives half a block from the church named Adele Almaguer. She's about this tall. 3 generations of her family didn't have enough money to feed everybody, and she said she was a good cook, and we said, prove it. She said, what do you mean? We'll cook for the custodian, secretary, and pastor lunch on Friday, so she cooks for us. We paid her for it. So the leadership of the neighborhood organization was meeting. She cooked for them. They loved it. She cooked for 3 things over the next 9 months. Studebaker Elementary at a PTA meeting. Southeast Side Neighborhood Health Center at an open house. Memorial Hospital at a press conference in our neighborhood. All these she cooked for. Then the Chamber of Commerce said, we want to have an all-day meeting of our leadership program in your church building. Well, that day works. That'll work all right. Well, since we're going to be there all day, we need to use your kitchen. We said, you can use our kitchen, but we would prefer you use our caterer. So we took $20 and bought her 1,000 business cards, said La Chaparrita Catering, spunky Tex-Mex food. And she fed 70 of them, the community and civic leaders there. They passed out her business card to everybody there. Through that, she got connected to the Michiana Businesswomen's Association. And a year and a half later, she opened up Adelitas Fajitas at the corner of 8th and Harrison in Elkhart. Now, if we had said to her when she showed up, how much was your income and how much were your expenses?
Or they would have kept telling them.
Yes, we would have all ended up poorer for it. And we would have missed a lot of great food.
And you didn't give her a program on how to cook or budget?
No, she didn't need to be trained. She needed people who saw her gift.
I think to tell somebody becomes difficult because we first in the church hadn't figured out. We've almost gotten rid of testimony time.
Yes. Tell them about the
lesson from
the contemporary church.
And sitting at, I mean, as you think about this, the tell somebody becomes important. Storytelling is a currency. And we started to learn that when we started to shift the structure. And the thing that you saw about Maya was the beginnings of that.
That's right.
But Mike started to come up in the group of people, the Lesson for Contemporary Church, because God didn't stop when the book went to press.
but continues to write in our lives and stories.
And it was one of the times that was kind of interesting because we get up and we did testimony, but we only talked about bad things that were not happening or problems. Needs, right? And we started to shift that, and we carved out the place and looked at the gospel reading or an Old Testament thing, and we would find someone in our community, not just the 4-block radius, but all of Indianapolis that matched the scriptures. And we would have that time. So
we would have them come and talk.
And it was a big part. It is a big part of the culture of that congregation. And in fact, it is probably like our most favorite time. Sorry,
way beats the sermon all day.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. But if you go to the church's website at broadwayumc.org, you can hear a lot of these lessons from the contemporary church. They're on there. But they become these times where somebody comes up and shares, this is the thing I care about. This is the gift I have. And then we say to people, who else cares about this same thing? Afterwards, would you come up? Would you lay a hand on this person? Sometimes we invite people to come up right then and bless this person, lay hands on them. But there are ways to do that.
Could you say a little bit about the use of chanting power, as we just did, understanding how problematic and complex that can be?
So for us, power is an interesting thing because a lot of people use the word empower. And if you're in places where people are low income, don't use that word because God give us power. I think Mike noticed that because I think my grandfather really was oppressed by white power. And he saw it happening to us, his children and grandchildren. And it was a reminder that God has given us power. That is the only power as Christians, right? When we say that, it is the reminder of the power that already exists in us. It's the reminder when your parents and your neighbors, and when we celebrate the people in the church, that's power.
Yeah, I don't know. I have much more to say to that. Yeah. I mean, I know that I'm in a position of privilege and that there is a different thing about power with me. But the biggest issue is people are all the time saying to us, hey, what you do is so great. It empowers people. No, we don't have to give power to people. People have it. We need to live as if the gospel is true. We need to bear witness to the fact that people have power and act like we believe it, but we don't a lot of times.
And you also have the power in your places outside of your congregations, whether you serve on committees or boards, to interrupt racism. Now that's power.
Diamond, say a little bit more about how you started your walks in the neighborhood and how it is that you connected with Mike, about telling Mike about your walks and the folk you were meeting.
I was just thinking, after 20 years, one of the things that constantly sticks with me is the first question Mike asked me. Tell me your story. We would take walks. It was every Monday. And those started that. And I realized that the power of friendship in the walks itself started to create a practice not only between us, but outside of us with our neighbors, right? To walk with us, with friends. The other thing that walking together dismantles the barriers that people have. Oftentimes, because of the way we learn colonially, even look at this. Us and them. We should be sitting in concentric circles. Like in our living rooms. The other thing was my wife, because of my depression, my wife would call my friends and say, could you come get him before I do something to him? And they would take me for a walk, and it would actually make me feel better. In the power of walking, we started to use that with our friends. We use it with CEOs, right? It equalizes power.
Can I say one other thing to this? So one of the neighbors Diamond mentioned was a neighbor named Wildstyle. And Wildstyle has a big active social media presence. And he put up a question about a month ago on social media. He said, have you ever been stopped before you committed a crime or committed some violence or anything? What stopped you? And over 300 people responded. And what people said back to him is, my friends stopped me. My mother stopped me. My brother stopped me.
No one mentioned a program.
Nobody said this anti-violence thing stopped me. Seriously. So why aren't we investing in the people who actually stop it? Power.
I'm not keeping track of the clock, so when we get ready to wind this down, somebody let me know.
You're doing good.
What advice would you give suburban churches who are sensing God's call to partner with urban churches or enter into urban partnerships?
Cultivate a structure in your current organizations that are not only church, but the ones you work in to receive abundance, right? So the practice of asking everybody in your pew, build up time and structure that so that when we go out, that may happen.
One of the ways this comes to us sometimes, I know, is because we talk to Carmel St. Mark's, right? Is they do a lot of mission in Indianapolis in low-income parts of the community. And we said to them, look, there's some people in your congregation who are really good listeners. You know who they are. We don't know who they are. Tell them to go to this meal that they go to, and other people are cooking, but you go and sit at that meal for a month and you just listen to stories. Then come back and sit with the pastor and the mission committee and say, what did you hear? What gifts did you hear? Did you notice? And see if something begins to rise about that.
Go to parties. Can I get an amen for that? And as people of privilege, when we come from suburbia, what we don't want to do is invite people to our parties. Get invited. Pay attention, be astonished, and tell somebody, right? Ask, can you bring a friend? And just listen and hang out, right?
Eat the good food, dance to the music. Yeah.
How have the roles of your church members changed as a result of your ministry in the community, in your community?
I think there has been a lot of transformation. But I can tell you the one that has probably impacted the places around us and where I live is that they have recognized their power to shift policy. And I say that the members of our church, we couldn't do what Mike was bragging about me doing without the people in the congregation going to legislators, working in the mayor's office, and recognizing, inviting, giving out the social capital that they have, the privilege they have, and making introductions to parties.
So what's your goal in your life over the next 5 years, you said, is to be the wealthiest person?
Mike, I'm already that.
Oh,
I call myself a social banker, and part of that is the noticing of how God's economy mixes with ours and how we cultivate relationships that build community, economy, and mutual delight.
Because people don't live on bread alone.
Right.
I think this question has to do with sort of our trying to wrap our heads around the perspective that you have. This person heard a rumor that your church had like 100 committees and that you canceled them all.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
So we did not have 100 committees. But we had 170 people and 175 committee slots. And I'm sure this is a unique experience in this room. Is that right? And what we decided to do, well, and to say a couple things about this. One is there is a rumor out there that we kill things. That is not true. We bury the dead. You know, we do not We do not kill things. We just notice and pay attention when something dies, and we celebrate it, and we thank it, and then we move on. But one of the things we did structurally was we ended up, and Diamond was part of this task force 16 years ago that said, if there aren't 3 people committed to doing something, we just aren't going to do it anymore. And then we decided to restructure the whole thing, not along the lines of what, the one church structure or this or that, but just something that made sense for us. And what made sense for us was that it really changed the way our governing council was. That's right. Instead of, so at our governing council in the United Methodist structure, that's called the ad board, right? The ad board would meet, and by the second hour, everybody in the room is dead, right? I mean, all the energy is gone, all the stuff is, and we just said, we're just not going to listen to reports anymore. No reports anymore in this. And what we're going to do is we're going to invite 2 to 4 people to come and briefly share, and we worked with people to briefly share what gift, what call they had in their life in the world. Not in the church, but in their life in the world. And then we would spend the major time of our meeting talking about what does it mean to be a congregation that holds these gifts in our hands. So we did away with a lot of committees because, the outreach committee used to be 7 different committees, and it had collapsed into one, but what they hadn't collapsed was all their areas of responsibility.
So we can only feel bad about what wasn't going on.
Right. Even if they did something, it was just always, we didn't do these other things, and they'd feel lousy about it.
But we did another thing practically on Sunday, is we had funerals, and they lasted over a year. And we buried things.
Right.
And what do we bury, Mike?
What's that?
What are some of the things we buried?
So we had a thrift shop that had been run by 80 and 90-year-old women, and they hadn't wanted to run it anymore. And so they stopped, and we put in the bulletin, the thrift shop no longer is open, it no longer exists, but people kept acting like it did. They kept donating to it.
And it was a room in the corner. It was closed, stacked up high. Anybody know that?
Yeah. And it was like, so one Sunday morning, the animators of Spirit got up and said, well, anybody who's ever worked in the thrift shop, please come forward. And we gave people a gift. And then we said, well, anybody who's ever donated to the thrift shop, please stand. And people stood. And then we said together as a congregation, well done, good and faithful servants. And people knew it was done because together in worship we had done this. So it took us 3 years to bury everything that was dead. But
the last thing
the last thing was one of our lay leaders came and said, I have this idea. And she got up in front of the congregation and said, well, anybody who's ever said we've always done it that way before, please stand. And then we said together, well done, good and faithful servants. So over 6 months later, one of the pillars of the church came to me and said, Mike, I'm not saying we've always done it that way before, but the reason he said but was because together in worship,
we had
affirmed and laughed about it. It was important.
Diamond and Mike, you are, as a church and as an organization and as a neighborhood, getting some attention in Indianapolis. There are some people in the Community Foundation in Indianapolis, Central Indiana Community Foundation, Lilly Endowment, other people are noticing what you're saying. In what way are you cautious not to be co-opted by their attention? And in what way are you helping change the conversation that they wanted to have?
Yeah, well, Mike got a job, but they coming after me. I say that because my black skin. In the time where equity projects around the country are picking up, and they want people like me. But what they don't want is people like my neighbors, who is me. And so one of the things that, because of our profile, and there is power in being a white male, right?
Yes.
Right? But there's power in friendship. One of the things I can get him to do is interrupt racism enough to buy us time to come up with something strategic. And one of the things, if you enter into contract with the learning tree, you have to accept all of us. So if we picked a low-income mom of 10, you use her. And you pay her $200 an hour. The other thing is, if you're going to engage with us, not only do you have your lower level staff, but we created a social agreement that the board, that everything that make these bones work is accessible to the community. So part of that with Central Indiana Community Foundation, we have the learning contract to reshift their strategic plan and help them live it out. So they've let us hire what they call community ambassadors. So there's people that come from all walks, and they're paid or funded to do what they already do. They don't work for CICF, but they learn from them. And we ask 3 questions. What are you trying to change? What are you willing to lose? And who are you willing to learn from?
Those are really important questions. Can you expound on them a little bit? Say them again and expound on them a little bit.
What are you trying to change? Mike just talked about the work of the church in saying that before what they were trying to do is change the odds, but they kept doing summer programs. So what are we trying to change, right? And for us, we want you to be explicit, truthful about what you really want to change. And if you do that, you have to lose something. And in this work, it's power. The power you have over somebody. Willing to lose being in front. Moving behind the scenes. Losing something to gain something is a process. Right? And so it's kind of an act of grieving. Who are you willing to learn from is one of my favorite. Because Mike is one of the greatest students that I know. And I say that because he's always astonished about what he pays attention to. And he celebrates that. And it's usually the people that most of us wouldn't hang out with. Right? We can learn from someone that doesn't have a high school diploma, who struggle with depression. We can learn from people who are suffering through addiction. Those are our teachers. Who are we willing to learn from?
Actually, it reminds me of, we had a group come from Ohio to visit us. It was from a church, and they said, sure, everybody has a gift, but what about people who struggle with mental illness and people who are addicted? And I said, well, we make them the chairs of our committees. and they laughed, and we said, no, it's true. At the time, the chair of our finance committee was a man who's addicted to meth. But we have never had anybody who is better able to explain the complicated finances of our place and was more patient about it than Todd was. If we said to Todd, because you're addicted, we weren't going to use your gift, we'd be poor for it. Fran was chair of our governing council. Fran's bipolar. Fran also has good jobs. She does good work. And she was a great chair of the governing council. She's now chair of finance. You maybe see a theme here. But if we said to her, just because you struggle with mental illness, you can't do this. I mean, and who among us doesn't have problems? We all do. Anyway.
Sometimes we go to conferences and we wished that we just got the 3 steps to do the thing. And what you've given us is 3 questions that are so open-ended. Do you ever hear frustration about that from people when you go speaking to them?
You know, so we have people who come to us all the time and say, like, Diamon's official title a few years ago, nearly 20 years ago, was the roving listener. And he worked for the church for 2 years as the roving listener. That was, and he did that. But so we get people who come to us and say, hey, could you give us the job description for the roving listener? At Thanksgiving, my sister-in-law was carving the turkey, and she says to me, hey, our church is doing a strategic plan. We really like the roving listener thing. Could you give me the job description for that? And I said, no. And she looked up with the knife in her hand. And I said, no, we weren't looking for a roving listener. We saw Diamond, and we saw his gift, and we saw how much we needed it. And so we went to him and said, how'd you like to get paid for what you already do? We didn't go looking for a roving listener. You need to pay attention to what's in your place and figure out the unique way in which God is doing something around you. There are 1,000 different ways this works out. And it's different for everybody and for every place and for every people because God is different with everybody. We don't think people should do what we do. We do think people should look at the world like we do. That the world is abundant and that God's people are abundant. And that if we don't do that, who is going to do that?
And I think the other thing is that we try to help people learn the way we've learned. And when we talk about power, the reason why I say, who are you willing to learn from? That we already are familiar with those learnings. Your first learnings wasn't a piece of paper that you read. It was your mother giving you a hug or someone experiencing something or a meal at a table or on the porch. Those are very simple learnings that equalizes us all. Right? Our emotion is such more complex than living it out in our head. And then it's okay to live it out in your heart, but it's also good to walk and be witness to where it's lived out.
Beloved, help me say thank you to Mike and Diamond.